So, historians looking at this multi-causal factors also look at the tax burden and the fact that the tax rates paid by indigenous people were going up. And this was a major grievance. And there's lots of letters in the archives from Maya communities to liberal officials saying, this is fundamentally unjust and unfair, right? Colonialism did impose taxes, but they were weighing particularly heavy on indigenous people. And indigenous elites, people like I and Pat and Chi, who were pretty well off, substantial landowners and merchants, they had been stripped of some of the exemptions they had under that people of their status had under colonial rule. And so this was a grievance for the sort of upper, best off of the Maya population. The Batabs, and we were talking about this while we were changing ships here, the Batab or Cacique, the elites in Maya communities, still had a lot of responsibilities to collect taxes, to enforce the law, but the kind of prerogatives and privileges that they had enjoyed were being eroded. And liberalism had erased a lot of the institutions that Maya elites, both civil and religious institutions, that Maya elite had used for their own benefit and the benefit of their communities. These were under stress, right? And historians like Rubley argue that the people like I and Pat and Chi were not wild-eyed radicals. They were rational, calculating, mature leaders who were between a rock and a hard place, caught between the need to protect their people and their own interests and the demands of the liberal state and outsiders, and without the means and resources they had to mitigate those demands. Right? So they had been painted into a corner, in a sense. And fourthly, keep in mind that indigenous people throughout colonial rule had been prevented from serving in the militia, were not supposed to own firearms. Only Maya elite could have horses, even. And this colonial practice of keeping the indigenous population demilitarized ended with independence. And as white elites were divided into factions, and regional and ideological struggles took off all across Latin America after independence. Independence was followed by more war. Some elites, non-Maya elites, began to arm Maya people and promised them tax exemptions. Okay. The Maya took the guns and gained military experience, and they expected the elites, non-Maya elites, to honor the promises for tax exemptions, other political concessions, which were often yanked back. And in particular, in 1839, one of the warlords in Yucatan, would-be warlord, sort of you guys have heard of Santa Anna, the sort of classic Mexican warlord, sort of the would-be mini Santa Annas, Santiago Imán. In 1839, in the name of federalism, sort of Yucatan home rule, tell the national government to keep its hands off, armed a lot of Maya people in eastern and southern Yucatan, and actually led them on an attack against whites in a large town in the east. And this was the first time, really, since the conquest, that Maya people, Maya soldiers, had fought and won a battle against non-Maya people. And there's a pretty powerful reason to think that this precedent was observed by a number of Maya, even those that didn't participate in this uprising. And there was a sense that the non-Maya elites who'd had the upper hand for a long time were now weak and divided. And this was a time for the Maya to push back. Right? Questions about this? Okay, so the war is ignited in September of 1847 by Chief and Tat. The high point of the Caste War rebels' success in early 1848, they have the government forces surrounded in Merida, cornered in the northwestern upper corner of the peninsula. They had cannons that were capable of shelling Merida into surrender. But for reasons that are still not entirely clear, they pulled back. And by May, we're in fact returning to the south and east. Now, there's different theories. One is that there was no single leader in the Maya camp at this point. Pat and Chi had become bitter enemies by this time. To coordinate the campaign, another argument is timing. May is when the corn has to be planted. And these are not professional full-time soldiers. These are peasants. And if they can't plant the corn before the raids come, they don't eat. So basically the campaign was ended by the agricultural cycle. Whatever the reason, the government gets a breathing space. And it takes advantage of this to patch up relations with Mexico City and buy guns and even seek volunteers from the United States. And some 700 troops, mostly from the southern states, do come down and fight as mercenaries for the Mexican government against the Maya. The first initial push of the Maya is beaten back, and the government begins to slowly push the Maya back to the south and east. And over the next 2 years, the government forces retake much of the Yucatan Peninsula from the hands of the rebels. This crisis leads to a second transformation of the revolt, and that is, in the middle of 1850, a miraculous cross begins to speak to one Maya leader. And again, there is this tradition that Sheely and Friedel have referred to of stones or wood, trees speaking. And there is a prophetic tradition within Maya religious belief as well. The emergence of a speaking cross seems providential because it inspires Maya resistance at a time when the government forces seem to be gaining the upper hand. And the cross serves as a rallying point for a second generation of rebel leaders to stiffen the rebel resistance against the government counteroffensive. In the mid-1850s, the government forces undergo a number of reverses. There's more trouble between the government of Yucatan and Mexico City. A civil war breaks out in central Mexico, and the military successes of the last 2 years end, and the Maya begin to successfully launch ambushes and even counterattacks. So what we see in the mid-1850s is a recovery and a stabilization of the rebel cause, very much linked to the emergence of the speaking cross. This is a reconstruction of what one of the early shrines might look like. The process that anthropologists used to refer to the creation of a new ethnic identity is ethnogenesis. And the impact of the cross was so great, the power of the cross was so great, that the rebels took the name People of the Cross. Cruz from the Spanish cross, and O from the Yucatec Maya plural, Cruzo. The people of the cross. People of the cross that speaks. And in the eastern part of Yucatan, the Maya built a holy city and a Spanish-style church known as Balamna, House of the Jaguar, to house the speaking cross. Now, it's important to note that the cross was not like a ventriloquist act. There was a whistling sound emitted from the cross that some people suspect was made by a small boy that was inside the cross. And the whistles were translated into Maya by a scribe that was the interpreter of the cross. And the cross had its own wax seal. The cross issued correspondence. And the person who interpreted the cross was the third highest ranking member of Crusoe society. There was also a very well organized military and even a spy or intelligence service based in the Crusoe capital that coordinated the war effort for the rest of the war. And the emergence of the speaking cross galvanized the rebels and set the stage for a series of counterattacks in the mid-1850s. And by the 1860s, a stalemate has emerged in which the front lines, more or less between the modern states of Yucatan and Quintana Roo, which is more or less the eastern third of the peninsula, emerges. You can see more or less the boundaries in 1857. This is where Balamna, the Crusoe capital, is, known as Santa Cruz, Holy Cross. Pacificos were neutrals, Maya people who chose neither to fight for the government nor the rebels, and were driven into southern Campeche and even down into the Petén region in Guatemala. The war spilled over into what today is Belize because the Crusoe rebels were supplied with arms by the British based in Belize, which made it much harder for the Mexican government to deliver a military crushing victory against the rebels. The Mexican state itself was divided in a civil war through most of the 1850s and the 1860s. And the government's probably best chance to end the caste war during the 19th century failed in 1860 when the Crusoe troops repelled a large Mexican government force sent to crush them and take Santa Cruz. During the course of the war, both sides, leaders of both sides, warlords on both sides, engaged in profiteering. But the most egregious part of profiting from this war was undoubtedly the sale of Maya slaves. Captured Crusoe rebels were sold to the sugar plantations of Cuba, several thousand, before the President of Mexico, Benito Juarez, put an end to the trade officially in 1861. The Crusoes took slaves as well, although they did not sell them. They enslaved not only whites, but also Maya people that fought against them. And the Maya capital of Santa Cruz was actually built largely by slave labor. In the mid-1860s, in one of these remarkable chapters, almost surreal chapters of Latin American history, Mexico was occupied by the French, which hoped to convert it into part of its colonial empire, and the Austrian emperor of the short-lived ephemeral French Empire, Maximilian, sent his wife, Carlota, to visit Yucatan. In spite of being a European monarch championed by conservatives in Mexico, Maximilian was actually pretty liberal-minded. He sought to mobilize support from indigenous Mexicans by promising to return some of the land that had been taken from them by the liberals, although he never complied. There was an attempt. And he sent his wife, Carlota, to visit Yucatan, and her visit is in some ways the beginning of the modern tourist industry. They took her to Uxmal, and the chain that for years and years you could use to help climb up the stairs to the pyramid. This has been stopped because of the traffic has damaged the monuments. They actually strung the first chain up to help her go up in this huge dress they get to the top of the pyramid, which she did. And photography, especially French photographers, piqued the interest of European and later U.S. tourists to visit the archaeological zones in Yucatan. For the rest of the 19th century, the government troops, in decades of struggle, very bloody, inconclusive warfare, slowly contained and then pushed back the Crusoe rebels. More or less, the modern state of Quintana Roo remains defended and occupied by the Crusoe rebels. A second and third generation of rebel leaders emerge. There's an uneasy triumvirate between Bernardino O'Higgins, Bonifacio Novello, and Crescencio Pu, who are overthrown by Anastasio Tzul, who seizes power in 1885 and is the last single strong, dominant military leader on the Crusoe side. In 1886, the Crusoe launched their last major raid against a large Yucatecan town. From then on, the government forces have basically contained the rebels in eastern Yucatan, setting the stage in 1901 for the last struggle to wipe out the rebels. Santa Cruz is taken in 1901, which, according to most people, marks the end of the caste war. The victory of the government forces is a result more of political and economic events outside of Yucatan than anything that happened on the Yucatan Peninsula. During the 1880s and 1890s, a modernizing dictator named Porfirio Diaz seizes power in Mexico, ends decades of civil war, and creates a strong autocratic state that creates the conditions for massive foreign investment and allows Mexico's elite and foreign investors to benefit from a wave of exports. Oil, minerals in the north, and henequen, a plant we'll talk a lot about, as an agricultural export in southeastern Yucatan. With the wealth created through commodity exports, Porfirio Diaz creates a modern army in Mexico. And the technology that the Mexican army can bring to bear by 1900 is simply unbeatable. The railroad solves the supply problem in eastern Yucatan for the Mexican army. The repeating rifle and the machine gun give the Mexican army a military advantage over the Crusoe rebels. The telegraph allows the national government in Mexico City to coordinate this campaign in the remote Yucatan, eastern Yucatan. And maybe most importantly, modern medicine, right? Ends the high death rates from epidemic diseases, things like malaria, which was a horrible problem in the jungles of eastern Yucatan, which allows the Mexican army to keep its forces in the field and fighting against the rebels. The rebels simply can't match this. Their capital was taken in 1901. Although bands of Crusoe melt away into the jungle, and there are isolated villages as late as the 1970s that still refuse to fly the Mexican flag and still ask visiting foreign anthropologists about where they can find British merchants to buy guns to fight the Mexican government. So, questions about that? Okay, thanks for coming out. We will get to Guatemala, believe it or not, in our next lecture.